Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Small Businesses Double Your Sales Revenue Without Spending Another Dollar on Marketing. My name is Steve Jones, Vice President of Marketing here at Corporate Visions, and I'll be moderating today's event. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so we can make today's event as interactive as we can for everybody on the call. You've joined the presentation using your computer speakers by default, but if you'd prefer to join over the telephone, just go ahead and select telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll also have the opportunity to submit text questions to our presenter today by typing your question into the questions pane on the control panel. Feel free to send in your questions at any time during today's event, and I'll go ahead and collect those, and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation today. Also, as a reminder, following the event, everybody on this webcast will be receiving the recording of today's event, along with the slides within the next 24 hours or so. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's event, Tim Reister, Chief Strategy Officer here at Corporate Visions and co-author of best-selling books like Customer Message Management, Increasing Marketing's Impact on Selling, Conversations That Win the Complex Sale, and the 3 Value Conversations. Tim, let me turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Steve, and thanks everybody for being here today. Appreciate this opportunity to address the small to medium business. You guys have unique challenges in terms of marketing and sales, the dollars you have allocated and the return you're looking for. And we have some special research-backed ideas to share with you today that we think will really be a difference maker when it comes to converting opportunities. So let's just take a sort of a simple look at the problem as we're starting to see it in small businesses today. And that's, if everything was cooking and everything was working well, you would be putting a lot of leads into your funnel, and the appropriate percentage would be coming out as deals on the other side. There's algorithms and math and other things involved that say, here's how much should convert. But there's a nasty sort of unspoken problem that most people are not aware of that is causing fewer and fewer leads to get down into the deal flow, the ultimate pipeline, if you will, move from funnel to pipeline. And that's some research that we've seen and been part of with organizations like Forrester and Gartner and other analysts who have identified that buyers believe that the majority of the conversations they have with sellers are not worth a second conversation. So if you are in a market where it requires more than one conversation to close something, this is really important to you. You need that second conversation. You need to get deeper inside of the customer prospect organization and reach the right decision maker and reach the right group of decision makers. So not even getting past the first conversation is going to kill the funnel. And so most people are dealing with conversion rates that they don't even realize are suffering from this hidden problem. And so I call it the conversion gap. The conversion gap between the lead coming in and that first call that you have, where the majority, let's say 9 out of 10, don't even move forward, but not because you don't have something of value to sell. It's that you didn't have anything of value to say. And that's what I want to talk about today. So before you start pouring more leads in the top of the funnel, thinking that's the problem, because that costs a lot of extra money to put more leads in the top of the funnel. And the only problem you're going to see when you pour more leads in the top of a funnel that's as constrained as this one, where 9 out of 10 calls die after the first call, is what I call a constipated funnel. And the constipated funnel is just a waste of marketing dollars. So what we want to talk about today is how you break through the constipated funnel, how you overcome the conversion gap. And in essence, that means you have to tell a better first story on that first call. And too many first calls sound the same as everybody else. All your products and services sound like everybody else, or you ask all the same questions as somebody else, and your prospect or customer just sees absolutely no material difference or no sense of urgency to go further with you. So let's talk about what is what essentially I believe is XLAX for your sales funnel. And that is to get more opportunities into real pipeline and create more winnable opportunities and do that without spending a single extra dollar in marketing. My premise is that when 9 out of 10 first calls fail, you need to fix that problem before you start spending more money on marketing. And the conversation problem is one that you can fix with the resources already at your disposal if you understand the approach you need to take in these first calls. So the question really becomes, what story should you be telling? Well, the way to understand what story you should be telling on that first call is by first understanding which one you should not be telling. And here's what our research tells us. When a prospect engages and raises their hand and says, yeah, I'll talk to you, the assumption is that you are in a real deal cycle. I always joke that you figure that if somebody raises their hand, they must be thinking about doing something and they must be thinking about who they want to do that with, because nobody just raises their hand to talk to a salesperson because nobody's that lonely. So you figure it's an active opportunity if they're willingly raising their hand, consuming your content, and taking an appointment with you. The truth of the matter is that 60 to 80% of the people that you're speaking with on that first call end up with, like I said, either both not taking a second call. Even if you get the second call, the vast majority end up making no decision anyways. So you kind of have two conversion problems. One, getting past that first call, and then two, getting them through the pipeline. And here's what we discovered the problem was. The prevailing presumption in terms of the pitches or the messages that you use in first calls are all designed to either facilitate or tell a story about why you, or, if you're thinking about it, why us? Because the presumption, again, is you're in a competitive battle, that they've raised their hand and they're considering change and they're looking for the right vendor. The problem is that's not the question that they're really asking themselves. At least 60 to 80% of the people you're talking to are not asking why you versus somebody else. They're asking, why should I change? Why should I do anything different? In fact, your enemy isn't a competitor, your enemy is inertia. And that first call, the primary job of that first call is to make sure that somebody senses a real urgent need to make a change. And that conversation, the why change conversation, is a completely different psychology. And as a result, the story and message you have is a completely different structure. And the skills to tell that story are completely different than you've been teaching your salespeople when you teach them about your products or teach them on the latest questioning methodology. In fact, it's been proven in research that 74% of decision makers give their business to the company that inspires and creates the buying vision. And only 26% give it to the winner of a fair and square sort of competitive bake-off or beauty contest. In other words, folks, the one company who can inspire and answer the why change question will win more than their fair share, will inspire a greater percentage of people to the next call, and will close a greater percentage of their deals and opportunities. So what I want to talk about today is quickly talk about how you can create a better first why change call that inspires a buying vision, that converts more people from first call to second call, and creates more stalled no decisions into closed deals. And it's not something they teach you in typical sales training. And so it's going to be different. And what's going to be different though is it's just a different conversation, and it's a different story. It's not a lot of more marketing dollars or a lot more product development dollars. It's just simply changing the value you communicate and create in that first conversation. In fact, I'm going to tell you a story later about a company we worked with to build a why change story. And what they were able to do is literally take a new story to 119 stalled no decision deals that got hooked and then disappeared, and go back after them. And 90 days later, they were able to reignite 115 of those 119. So they literally improved their conversion gap by 96%. So I want to tell you that story and more detail around it later, but first you got to understand how they got there. So there's what I call rescue revenue that's sitting here inside of your funnel and pipeline where you don't have to spend a single extra dollar on marketing to reclaim it. And we'll tell you that story when I get to it. So here's the deal. You need to understand a little science of how people change their mind, a little science behind why they don't change their mind. In fact, it's some simple science that you kind of maybe know but didn't have a good frame for. And that's this idea that humans live in status quo bias, that the people you're talking to are kicking tires. They're trying to figure out, am I doing it okay? Or do I need to do anything different? Or do I really need to change? And when they're doing that, they're actually trying not to. Like I said, inertia and gravity are your biggest enemies. And so there are 4 reasons people will not change. There are 4 causes that people will stick with their status quo. And your first call, your why change story, needs to address these 4 causes. So I'm going to quickly walk you through the 4 causes of status quo bias, and you should compare your first call messages and your first conversation stories to this structure and see if there's ways that you can improve it and make the difference that we can show you. So the first idea is that people live in preference stability. Preferences are a big deal in human decision-making research, and that's where I spend my time. Just a little background. Everything you're going to hear from me is from the perspective of what we call the decision-making sciences, the invisible forces that shape the way people make decisions. It's how people frame value and they make choices. So this isn't even about what a seller does. It's about what's going on in the mind of the buyer. And preferences are a big deal. When people make a decision, it becomes their preference. And people want to keep their current preferences stable. People don't like living in instability. But the problem is that in order to help them change their mind, your message, your first conversation needs to lean into and actually destabilize their current preferences. The problem with just asking the customer questions is it unwittingly reinforces their current preferences. They already know these things, and you're kind of restabilizing them on the things they know. And you end up doing nothing to provoke or inspire them to think, hey, maybe I have to change. And that's why so many people will raise their hand and then get to the end of a deal cycle, going into it thinking maybe I'm not okay, and then coming out on the other end going, oh, I guess I'm okay. Because nobody created the uncertainty required for persuasion. The science of decision making says that persuasion and change isn't even possible unless you introduce some uncertainty. Do your messages, do your stories introduce something the customer wasn't expecting? Does it tell them about a need or a problem they didn't fully appreciate or didn't completely understand the magnitude of? Did you introduce an opportunity they might be missing out on and can't take advantage of if they don't do something different? So there's actually a little bit of science behind that, brain science, and I'm going to be totally honest. Most of us went into marketing and sales to avoid science, but here's a little science for you today. Essentially, what you need to understand is there's 2 parts of the brain that help make a decision. And the seminal book on this is a book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. So if you're looking for any good reading, you need to check that out. And it talks about system 1, thinking fast, system 2, thinking slow. And what happens is system 1, the fast part of the decision-making process, is very emotional intuitive, and its main job is to serve as humans' survival mechanism. It turns out all the science is able to show that people make the decision to change in this part of the brain, and then they explain, justify, or otherwise validate the decision in the rational part of the brain. And what happens is the capacity for language resides in the rational brain. So when you ask a customer, what's it gonna take to make a decision here? They will explain things very rationally and logically to you about a process that's actually emotional and intuitive. So literally customers unwittingly lie to you about what it's going to take to get them to change. And no one wants to say it's going to take something disruptive, uncertain, and destabilizing. They will tell you it's going to take an ROI and a TCO and all these other mathematical things that they're going to want to use to explain to themselves why they made a decision, and explain to others. In fact, the science today says that all decisions are emotional intuitive, and that the rational brain is not a decision-making process, it's just an explaining process. If you think about it simply, the rational brain, it wants to think it's a scientist, but it's really just a talk show host. Does a lot of explaining and not a lot of doing. So as a result, you need to think about the emotional intuitive part of the brain designed for survival as being the change agent in the brain, but there's no capacity for language there. So you need to give the customer something they can't even express to you. You need to give them some uncertainty and destabilize their current preferences so that they see their current status quo approach as maybe not being as safe or sustainable or tenable as they might be thinking. Remember, they raised their hand. So they're slightly worried something might be off, and your job is to help them see where that is. So you're not trying to make them feel bad, and you're not trying to make them feel stupid, and you're not trying to impose fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You're trying to validate in a way a concern they already have when they raise their hand that they might be missing something. And your job isn't to ask them what they already know, it's to tell them the thing they're missing. Second, the cost of action and change. People believe that the status quo is free. It's just sort of functioning and operating. It's just part of standard operating procedure. And so they think that making the change is going to be where all the cost is. Oh, it's going to cost me time. I'm going to have to go through a decision-making process. It's going to cost me some money. I'm going to have to think about how to budget for this and how I need to pay for all the startup costs. And it's going to cost me stomach lining because I'm going to have to generate a consensus, and I'm going to have to use personal equity to get this thing through. And they start to think about it. And now instead of a solution, your offering looks like a change management project, and change management projects are risky and costly. And so they go, you know, it's not perfect today. It's not exactly like I want it, but it's not bad enough for me to go through that change management project and figure out how to pay for it. Your job then, as a result, to defeat status quo bias is to actually show them there's a cost of staying the same. Until somebody sees the cost of staying the same, they are not willing to take the risk of making a change. You've heard of the concept of risk aversion. I want to introduce you into the concept of risk seeking. How can you get your prospect to actually be moving toward risk, seeking risk, instead of trying to avoid it? Well, it requires you to show them the cost of staying the same, not just the benefit of making the change. Here's one more piece of science that I want to give you that will help you understand this a little bit. It turns out that in the last 30 years, in behavioral economics and social psychology of buying and decision making, they've been able to show that people are 2 to 3 times more likely to be willing to make a change and do something different to avoid a loss than they will to make that change to get a gain. So listen to me. Most of your value propositions, feature benefit statements, and everything else that point to the potential gain and upside do not create enough momentum or do not create enough horsepower for you to convince the customer to leave their status quo, because that gain is a potential gain, but everybody realizes their results may vary. So it's a change management project to get a gain that's going to cost me something, whereas maybe it's not perfect today, but it is free and I know what I've got. The truth of the matter is they will not move, and this is the science of risk seeking, they will not move until they believe, and they will not seek risk and try something different until they believe there is a cost or a loss associated with staying the same that is at least equal to or greater than the cost of making the change. So in your story, when you think about it, is your first call, is your message helping introduce problems or missed opportunities that they didn't even know they had that begin to destabilize their preferences? And are you then showing where those missed opportunities or unknown problems or unconsidered needs are creating a cost or loss associated with staying the same, so that you now get people leaning into the direction of change and the risk that they should be seeking? The third reason people don't make a decision to change that affects your message and first calls is this idea of selection difficulty. Selection difficulty is the premise that everything looks the same, everything sounds the same, everything smells the same, everything tastes the same. Basically, when they look at what you're trying to tell them, they go, that seems a lot like what I'm already doing. That seems a lot like what everybody else is talking about. And here's what I can guarantee you is if anybody ever says the word, it's a lot like to you, that's not good news. Like is good news if you're on Facebook. Liking is good news if you're on LinkedIn. Liking is really bad news in a sales conversation because that's somebody basically saying, I can't even tell the difference. And what happens when they can't tell the difference? They're going to believe if it's all the same, why would I take the risk of change? So your job is to create a clear difference. In fact, the word you need to be thinking about is contrast. Decision making and the perception of value lives in this idea of contrast. Let me give you a visual here to explain this better. If you just come in to a new prospect who's raised their hand and you believe that your new thing is going to convince them that they should stop doing their old thing, and you simply tell a story about what's new and improved in your new thing, there's no contrast. There's no contrast in them seeing your new and improved because they have a hard time comparing that to what they're doing today. There's just something in human nature where they, whether it's hubris or whatever you want to call it, when you show them the new and improved thing, their natural reaction is, that seems a lot like what I'm already doing, because people have a real inability to frame up what they're currently doing, because what they're doing might be a set of historical decisions. It might be a kludged together Frankenstein monster sort of solution, and they're very bad at being able to compare things without you helping them. So I always say, if you just come in with a new and improved story, there's no contrast, so there's no value perception. If you come in with a story that sounds more or less like the competition or what they're already doing, there's also no value. People will not take risk to get more or less the same thing. There's just no reason to take that kind of risk on if you think you're getting more of the same. So what's required in your story is very clear and frankly very visual contrast between what they're doing today, and as I just described, those destabilizing, unconsidered needs or missed opportunities, and that cost or loss associated with staying there, let's bucket that as risk, and how you will resolve that on the other side. They need to see a clear difference in the way they're going to be doing something and a clear difference in the outcomes they will see, and then value can take place. So if you just want to take a bumper sticker away from here, value, the perception of value lives in the contrast. So if your story that you're telling today doesn't identify the missed opportunities and unconsidered needs associated with their current approach, and doesn't help show the cost and loss associated with that, and then contrast that with the way you will resolve those things, it's going to be hard for people to make a decision. That super simple, fast, emotional, intuitive part of the brain, the part of the brain that doesn't contain the capacity for language, needs very simple tools to make a decision. And the simplest one that it craves is contrast. So you need to deliver clear contrast in order for them to make a decision and leave their status quo bias. The fourth and final reason that people don't leave their status quo, the reason they don't take a second call, the reason that they get stuck and stalled, is this idea that humans can project or anticipate the regret and blame that will come if they make a decision that goes bad. And again, what they think about is, it's not perfect today, but the lights are on, I'm still getting a paycheck, and essentially they're thinking, I'm not dead yet. But if I make this company go through this proposed change and get on the other side and it doesn't work, that will kill me. So psychologically, there's this anticipated regret and blame that causes people to then, as you give them your pitch, deny they have a problem. So what you need in your story is not something you haven't heard of before. It's a proof point, it's a testimonial, it's a success story, it's a case study. But the science behind how you construct your proof story is really important. What you want to accomplish with your proof story is something that the scientists call self-persuasion. You want people to hear your story in the first call and start to try on and take ownership of what you're saying. You want them to put themselves into the story, because what you want to invoke is the concept of self-persuasion. And self-persuasion is the most powerful force and form of persuasion there is. The problem is that you're dealing with a group, right? These are the people that won't take the second call. These are the people that make no decision. You're dealing with a group that I call deniers. And so the question really became, how do you build a proof story that overcomes deniers? Most proof stories are built with results in mind for somebody who's already bought in and they want to see and validate your solution. But when you're in the status quo bias, you're dealing with deniers. And we found an interesting recipe for proof stories in Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. Alcoholics Anonymous they found out a long time ago, they can't point at a person and say, you're an alcoholic. That doesn't work. People go, no, I'm not. Well, they're deniers, right? They then discovered that the best way to do this was to put a former alcoholic, or a recovering alcoholic, I should say, on the stage in front of the room and talk about their journey. But they couldn't get up there and just say, Alcoholics Anonymous saved my life, because again, you're dealing with deniers. The breakthrough came when Alcoholics Anonymous created a proof story to overcome deniers that opened up like this: I didn't think I had a problem. And then they proceeded to tell the story of how they discovered they had a problem, how bad the problem was, and all the reasons for the problem, and then take the listener on a journey so that the listener could start to self-persuade, self-identify. So when you tell a proof story of your customer that you want to show your prospect, don't just jump to the good news on the back end. You have to take your prospect through the self-persuading model that says, you don't think you had a problem. This customer didn't think they had a problem. And you tell the story of life before, what it looked like, so that your new prospective customer goes, wow, sounds a lot like what I'm struggling with. That seems really familiar. That resonates with me. And then you move to the resolution and how it got better. So instead of, the Alcoholics Anonymous example here, what's your best customer example where you can tell the story of the before and their recognition and realization that they actually had a problem that they didn't know they had, or were missing an opportunity they didn't know they had, and the journey they went on with your company, and then the results and the impact. This is important, that your proof story support the contrast you just talked about, because what they want to hear is someone like them made this journey successfully. Don't just jump to the end and say they got $1 million uplift or 1,000% improvement. Talk about where they were and what it looked like, and then move them forward. So what I want to show you is a why change selling story framework, choreography, if you will, that your first calls, your first 5 minutes need to get the second call, and then the story that follows along the journey, so that as the sales cycle and the pipeline gets a little tough, you keep bringing this story back up and reminding people this is why we're on this journey together, because you agreed that a change needed to be made. And what you need to do in the why change stories, make sure there's a moment where you introduce uncertainty in order to destabilize their preferences. Tell them about the problem or missed opportunity they didn't even know they had. Then you pivot to inspire risk seeking. You show them the cost of staying the same or the loss to be avoided. And then you move to creating the clear contrast, the difference between their current state and their future state, so that they can make a decision about the value of taking on that risk of change. And then finally, you want to invoke the power of self-persuasion by telling a powerful before and after proof story, so that the denier can see themselves in the story and overcome anticipated regret and blame. So the 4 causes of status quo bias need to be defeated and overcome. And you need to construct a message that does that. And what I would tell you is the 4 causes of status quo bias are real. And this message choreography that I'm showing you works. And it works in a particular order. We've tested this with real business to business buyers. And what you're looking at is the winning model, the winning choreography. So I'm leaving that up there as sort of value for you today to see what the possibilities are. But I do want to take a moment now to just talk about your opportunity. What's your opportunity to rescue some revenue, get a second call, and improve that 89% failure rate that most first calls lead to, and reclaim stuck, stalled, stagnant, no decision situations? And you can do that by telling a why change story. In fact, here's my before and after proof point. So we were working with a company that does tax and accounting type services and programming. And they were struggling with stalled deals, no decision. They, in fact, when they engaged us, they identified 119 stalled no decision conversations. These were people that actually went through several sales calls. They were projected to be potential closes, and they just disappeared. They just evaporated. So you know what that's like. You can imagine there's probably a number you can come up with. And that's what I would ask you to do is, like, in the last year, how many do you think you have? How many active deals did you take through the pipeline only to get to the end and they just simply evaporated like cotton candy, right? They tasted good, you thought it was good, and then they just simply disappeared on your tongue. These just disappeared and you don't know why, and they stalled or stagnated, and people made no decision. So what's your number? So think about that, or maybe do some research on that, because here's what happened. We went into this company and helped them build a why change story using the framework I just taught you, and taught the salespeople to tell that story, because here's it's a different kind of story. If we're really honest, it's different than the typical product story or why us story. So you need both the story and the skills. And they were able to reignite 115 in the first 90 days. So they literally went back out and said, okay, we're going to take this new story out. They didn't put any new marketing dollars in. They didn't change the product in any way. They just changed the story. And they were able to reignite 115 and close it for millions and millions of dollars, like rescue revenue, because they were able to rescue it without putting another dollar in, except to just reframe their story and practice it a little bit. That was a 96% improvement in the conversion gap. Now, what I want you to do is sort of think about this for yourself. Do the math for yourself. What's your average deal size? Like, think about your average deal size. Is it $1,000, $2,000, $5,000, $10,000? And then multiply that times the number of stalled or dormant leads you have. So let's say you have $1,000 and you have 100 stalled deals. There's like $100,000 of rescue revenue out there. I did this at a conference last week, and one guy stood up in the crowd and he had identified $2.5 million in rescue revenue. And he chose a percentage, because here's what's key. I don't expect you to necessarily go out and convert 96% of that. So just pick a percentage. And this guy said he picked a 30% reignite and close rate, which is pretty conservative, on his stalled deals and average deal size. And he came up with $2.5 million of rescue revenue. So what I would ask is, do your own math on this. What would that look like for you if you're like our client and had X number of stalled deals times the deal size, take a meaningful percentage rate, even take a conservative one, and there is your rescue revenue rate. So then the question I would ask you is, what would you be willing to pay to get that? What would you be willing to pay to get that back? So let's take our $100,000 example, like $100,000 of rescue revenue, because that's a conservative number. And just write your number down so you know what your number is. What is your rescue revenue number? And I want to tell you quickly about a program that is now available to you. The kind of programs we've been doing with large B2B companies now being available to small B2B companies, thanks to our partnership with Tony Robbins. So Tony Robbins, you may know, as a personal development coach, and as a coach, he's also established a strong business consulting results coaching practice. And he approached us about our science and our sales content. And we have now formed a partnership with him called Sales Mastery, presented by Tony Robbins, using our science and skills training and blending that with Tony's experience in science and generating preference and influence. And what's resulting from that is a product we call Create Value. Create Value is all designed to overcome this conversion gap and designed to help you unstick stalled deals. And how it works, how we've packaged it up so that you can use it is it's a completely online experience, but it's also got some coaching and feedback. So let me explain that. The why change story that I just took you through is actually just one key concept in the Create Value skills training story building class that I'm talking about. There are 14 more proven persuasive story building storytelling concepts: how to grab and keep attention, how to change personal pronouns to create more interest, how to use visuals to improve storytelling, how to apply metaphors and analogies. The list goes on in terms of how to get people's attention, how to convince them to change, and then how to differentiate and distinguish yourself from all your competitors, literally answering both the why change and the why you question. So there's 15 e-learning modules, give or take, that are more or less 10 minutes in length, and each one teaches you one or a set of discrete techniques that you can learn. So it's self-paced, and it's got examples, it's got research to back it, and it's got exercises. Then in this course, you get 2 opportunities to build your story and get feedback on it, and practice your story and record yourself and get feedback on your presentation style. Because the course is going to teach you how to build these stories, and it's going to give you tips and techniques for how to tell these stories. And what you should know is that learning it and doing it in e-learning is one thing, right? You get knowledge, your head is now filled with some cool ideas, but you need to transfer that to your heart and to literally the physiology of you and your team. So at some point you need to submit the story, get feedback from experts. So our consultants, the ones who go out and train some of the largest, best organizations in the world on their stories and their skills, will review your submissions and give you detailed written feedback and commentary on your story and your delivery of your story. And you get to do that 2 times as part of this courseware. And then finally, you get unlimited access to the templates to build these stories and job aids to guide you in the building of these stories, and planners to help you do this for each account so that you can tailor it to that account, as well as a library of 25 1 to 3 minute videos to refresh and reinforce you on these concepts in like quick bursts, so that this is sustainable in your work and your organization's work. So it's a complete online experience, knowledge transfer, learning and e-learning, the practice coaching feedback in the online challenges that you get with our best coaches and consultants, and then the planners and job aids and refresher videos to make this sustainable for you and your organization. So what's interesting about the partnership with Tony Robbins is we've now made this available literally down to the individual level, where you can get online and you can buy this thing and do this thing and experience what these large companies have experienced. So our company, Corporate Visions, delivers this kind of message development and training work for some of the biggest, best companies in the world and some of the biggest, best sales forces in the world. And so if you think about professional selling, consulting, and skills training, more often than not, sometimes you think about something that's not accessible to the small business. You might not even have enough people to fill a classroom for a company like us, typically engaging organizations like that, which is why we've built this online program the way it is. And so what I want to do real quickly is show you how to get access to it, as well as offer you a deal through Tony Robbins. So I want you to remember what your rescue revenue number is. Like, do you have it written down? Have you looked at it? And then the question is, how much would you spend to go get that revenue? And guess what? You spend once and then you get that revenue every year, year after year, because now you've improved your conversations. The course list price is $19.95. But that's not the price that we're offering for you who have attended this webcast today. We've got a special code. Tony's famous words, as always, he goes, create an irresistible offer. Well, we hope this is. If you think about the rescue revenue number, let's say it's $100,000. The course is now available with this code for those of you on this call to go to our website and order it and have that online experience and that interactive coaching experience and all of the tools that I mentioned for $9.95 using the code CREATE, as in create value, CREATE19. So the premise here is that if you have $100,000 in rescue revenue that you think you can get with a conservative estimate, here's $1,000 spend or $1,000 investment to get that $100,000. That's like a 100x return. And the person who had 2.5 million in the course I was or the speech I gave last week saw instantly the ROI on this. And I think there's other numbers between 100,000 and 2.5 million on this call today, where this still looks like a really good ROI, a real good investment, because it's the gift that keeps on giving, right? This is an investment in building a message and telling that story that will work year after year after year. So any improvement you make in those first 90 days to recapture stalled, stagnant deals or get that second and third call because of this is something that will happen year after year for a one-time investment. So I often tell a story of Malcolm Gladwell and Morton Grodzins. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called The Tipping Point, and The Tipping Point became famous. But what most people don't know is on the other side there was a scientist named Morton Grodzins. Morton Grodzins was the founder of The Tipping Point. He researched it, he published on it, and he named it The Tipping Point 40 years before Malcolm Gladwell's book. But Malcolm Gladwell got rich and famous, made lots of money, charges lots of money, has written a lot of books. Morton Grodzins toiled and died in academic obscurity. So he had a first mover advantage. He had that product before anybody else, and he was the one who named it. He was the father of it. He had a 40-year head start, but nobody knows who he is. And I would submit that the reason Gladwell succeeded with a concept that wasn't even his is he told a better story. And what separates you from second and third conversations and what separates you from stalled or real decisions, right? No decision versus decision is a better story. And so with this course, this opportunity, you have a choice. Will you be Gladwell or will you be Grodzins? And I want to give you the tools so that you can succeed. So there it is. That's the story, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve now because we were willing to take questions and answers, and we'll use our rest of our time to deal with that.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. We do have several questions coming in here, but just as a reminder, you certainly can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. Our first question today is, what is Tony Robbins' actual involvement in the product? How did the partnership come about?
So the partnership came about when Tony was looking for, he teaches a course called Business Mastery. And time again, people identified one hole in the Business Mastery curriculum, and that was the sales piece. So he went out looking for a partnered sales company that had content that mapped well to his approach to the science backing. So he's very big in the neuroscience and the behavioral economics of how influence happens and persuasion happens. And he does a great job of talking about marketing funnel and marketing funnel conversion. And he saw our approach to sales conversation conversions and the science behind it as being completely synergistic and completing his view of the value chain. And so one of the things we did together was package this up and create a price point as he reviewed our content and validated it all as being aligned to the approaches he's recommending all around the sales piece, that this would fit in. We're continuing to work together to continue to update and refine this content, but he has reviewed it all, stamped it, and we've started presenting as part of his business mastery course as a featured component. I guess I'm even called a business mastery guru now. I don't know. That was some magical pixie dust that landed on my head. And that's pretty much how it worked. He reviewed, he said 50 different companies and their sales training content and chose this one as the one that was best aligned.
All right, fantastic. Next question. Everything I've ever read says that in-person training is more effective than online, especially for sales. Is there any science that backs that online is better?
Well, that's an interesting question, right? I mean, so online is certainly more efficient, right? You can do it when you can do it. You don't have to come out of the field, lose time out of the field. You can do it when you can do it. So it's really efficient, and it saves money because you don't have the costs of everything else that goes with the classroom training. So this actually becomes, the numbers are that sometimes the training is only half the cost of what it takes to get people out of the field, rent a room, feed them, all that kind of stuff. So it's certainly more efficient. But the question is well taken. It's often that online training has been just online training. You watch something and you take a quiz as if that's going to make you better at having a conversation. That's why we've introduced these online challenges, so that you can build something and get some actual feedback, record yourself and get some actual feedback. And we've been testing this. We have one company, I can't tell you who they are, but they are a major technology company. And recently they went and did side-by-side testing, classroom and online. And they took the same sales team in the same selling segment and divided them in half. Half went through online, half went through classroom. I'm sorry, they divided them into thirds actually. And one group didn't go through any training because they wanted sort of to see if the training made the difference, and then decide if online or classroom made the difference. And it was interesting. It's the people who went through the online work had twice as high of an increase in their confidence level. So qualitatively, the people who went through the online experience identified that they had a confidence level 2x of those who went through the classroom. So we think what happened is people spent a little extra time and were a little more diligent. And when they knew they had to record themselves and present that, they put more practice time into recorded challenges than they did for classroom. Because a classroom has a duration that comes and goes. You practice maybe once real quick and you get a little bit of quick feedback. Online, what we discovered is people, before they submitted their videos, would practice 6.3 times before hitting the submit button, which I submit to you is 5.3 more times than they practice in the classroom. So more practice is always good. And then more detailed feedback. So they felt more confident because instead of being in a classroom and having to zip through everybody in the room, our consultants can give more detailed, comprehensive, complete feedback. You practice more often on the thing before you submit it, and the confidence level went up. The interesting thing is when we measured KPIs, pipeline increases, deal size increases, what we found is that there was no drop off, that in fact, you got the same KPI increase, pipeline size and deal for the online group as you did for the classroom group. So this company's moving out with extreme confidence that they think online is as good as, and in some cases, potentially even a little better than the classroom. So interesting question, but we're now seeing data in the construct that I shared with you that is proving that you can make online just as effective.
Cool, thanks, Tim. Again, a lot of questions too about will the slides be available and will the recording be available? And the answer is yes. You should receive it sometime this afternoon, the recording and the slides. Worst case scenario would be in the morning, but look for them this afternoon. Next question here is, how do you encourage risk in traditionally risk-averse fields or roles?
So, hard to ask for some follow-up question on that when these are submitted questions. I would argue that all humans are risk averse. So the key, and we don't have time to talk about it today, but we spend way more time in this course talking about it, is how to identify and introduce something we call the unconsidered need. The problem with most diagnostic and discovery question-based selling techniques is you are asking people what their problems are, and so are your competitors, and they're telling you and your competitors the same exact problems. But human nature makes those problems not big enough to want to change for. They just make them problems. They're more like nuisance problems. So when everybody comes back with their pitches, their presentations based on the known specified problems, you get a lot of pushback from customers because the reality is your solution looks like such a big lift compared to the problems they shared. And there's not a lot of urgency. And as a result of you asking the same questions as everybody else, there's not a lot of uniqueness there. So the identification of and the introduction of unconsidered needs that will then lead to those unknown strengths of your organization. There's a whole module on how to create, identify, and introduce unconsidered needs that lead to your unknown strengths, and where you can tell a story that's more urgent and a story that's more unique. And I would tell you that this example I gave you of tax and accounting, that is a pretty risk-averse group. That's a group that has a lot of rules, a lot of laws, a lot of compliance, a lot of things associated with it. So if it worked for them, I gotta feel like it works in a lot of industries, because there's not a group that's typically more risk-averse than the folks who are doing our taxes and accounting.
All right, next question. When selling a B2B service where the real value is in time saved through convenience, how does the storytelling process differ?
So it's a B2B service. So I would tell you that the second largest group, in fact, this tax and accounting one was primarily a service. The technology wasn't the important part, it was the service. It was an outsourced service. It was outsourced tax and accounting and employee benefits management company. So it was a professional services group that like brought the expertise that you didn't have to keep on staff, created efficiency, took the risk off your plate. So there are all kinds of reasons that they told a story of how they, they introduced unconsidered needs, that having on-staff people doing it who couldn't keep up with tax changes and compliance needs and the risk that created, as well as spending money on a competency that's hard for you to maintain, and being able to do it more efficiently with people who do it all day long every day. And so there was a great business story in the example that I told you. That's an example of a business service. And again, so I would say that there's examples in this course that I think are very germane to that particular market. Another example in the course talks about banks offering loans, a line of credit. Again, it's sort of a business service, right? There's money involved, but really it's a business service, because the line of credit is something you sell that's abstract. You can't touch it. In some ways, you don't even want to touch it. So all I could say is that is a sweet spot for this type of storytelling, because many times it's this storytelling helps make something tangible that might otherwise not be tangible. And in making it tangible, you make it visceral and emotional. So that's the key to some of these concepts. And I think business services or professional services are ripe for this kind of storytelling approach.
Okay, next question. The why change story really seems to work with the decision makers. How do you use this model to navigate your way to the decision makers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would also argue it works well with your children and your significant other, but that's free for you. That model is really powerful, because in fact the model was born out of change management principles, not selling principles. So the science of change management is what you see at work here. So as leaders who are trying to motivate your employees, you can use the why change model. And as parents trying to motivate your children, try it as well. But in terms of accessing decision makers, I think the key is that there are people in the organization, let's call them influencers or gatekeepers, who are often the ones who are initially sort of scraping the internet trying to find good ideas that they can place their mark on. And oftentimes decision maker, especially senior decision maker meetings, are sponsored meetings. But you have to give your sponsor, the influencer, or maybe the person a tick below the decision maker, a meaningful reason to call that meeting and kind of earn that. And so what I would say is, is this is good for the decision maker. And if you're not talking to the decision maker, but you're talking to the influencer, this is the opportunity for them to sponsor a meaningful meeting that will give them some visibility, will give them a good reason to move this forward and gain some leverage internally. So what you're doing with this story is equipping and enabling them to bring this forward into the organization. That's the way I see this primarily working, because most senior level decision maker meetings are sponsored meetings by somebody, and those senior level decision makers have created that buffer zone. In fact, our research showed that at a minimum, 87% of executive meetings happen only because a sponsor brings you there. Very few senior executive decision makers take direct calls and meetings. So you need to see this as equipping and enabling and making some meaning for that influencer to move this forward.
Okay, next question here. I used Corporate Visions at my last company, and they've always been known as an enterprise sales training company. Is this just a light version of your enterprise product?
So I'm going to argue that it's not a light version. It's now an accessible version. We created a storefront. Once we were able to congeal an online version of our enterprise training to create the e-learning, the online practice coaching feedback mechanism, and then we developed that portfolio of reinforcement videos and the like, we were able to package up a complete experience and put it on, with Tony's help, build a storefront, because you'll see when you go to buy this, it ends up in Tony's storefront. That could make this basically available to a single individual with the swipe of a credit card. And it is the enterprise caliber content, the e-learning modules and the practice, the online challenges that we have, the rubrics that our consultants use to judge and measure you will be the same we use with the enterprise company. So this is the same. The only thing different is it's not in a classroom with our world-class consultants. But if we have our enterprise clients are doing this online and virtual, they're actually engaging the same content you are. So we have not held anything back here. And we're excited about this offering and this branding opportunity with the Robbins Group. So rest assured, you are able to access now for small teams or down to the individual level, the same caliber of proven enterprise class training content.
Okay, last question here is, how long will this promo code be valid?
Hey, I would love to tell you it's today only, but this is something that we've got as a code that we currently have. What is today? We're in May. We have till the end of the month on this code, and you have till the end of the month on this code. But that's the agreement we currently have with Robbins. So you're going to want to take advantage of it sooner than later. The best part is you make the decision now. You don't have to take all this stuff. It doesn't disappear on you. You can sign up for it now, take advantage of the code, get it. And because I know it can sometimes take a little while to organize your teams and such, but know that this is now yours, and so you have access to it. So you don't have to panic that you might not be able to get to it right away, but you do want to get a hold of it right away.
Okay, hey, you know what? We had one other great question come in, so I want to make sure and get this one over to you, Tim, as well. Do you find that creating this type of story treads on the toes of marketing departments who see it as their role to create a compelling story?
You know, this is it. What's funny about the training is it's kind of looks like sales training, but it arguably could be presented to marketing as marketing training. And you know what I would do is sit your marketing department down and watch this together, because learning about status quo bias, learning about the why change story model, why not engage your marketing team? You're a small company, do it together so that they start producing messages and content assets that reflect this science. So that would be my encouragement to you is, hey, let's look at this together, because it's really a messaging, how to be a better messenger, how to be a more persuasive, influential messenger. And that's kind of a marketing and sales thing. So get a license and sit down with your marketing colleague and figure it out and look at it together as a persuasive storytelling model, not like, oh, here's my sales training marketer, Mr. or Mrs. Marketer, would you please follow it? Watch it together and see it as a way to align yourselves. In the meantime, if that doesn't work, all you can tell marketing, you can just tell marketing, hey, thanks for the starter content. I'm now going to translate it into make it more customer centric and sales ready. And you can use this, we often say, as the translating filtering agent to make it ready for customers and ready for you to use on the sales front. And it's really not taking away from marketing, it's just enhancing it for this conversation, the sales conversation level. So there you go. Hopefully that helps. I guess the big thing I want to do is broker peace between marketing and sales and ask that you would watch this with them and do it as a team effort.
All right, thanks, Tim. And really, thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. If we were unable to get to your question during the webinar, we certainly will answer it after the event via email. So on behalf of Tim and myself, thank you again so much for joining us today, and have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you.